Hello, everyone. My name is Jackie Kucinich. I am the Washington Bureau Chief for the Boston Globe, and I am here with Nancy Gibbs, who is the director of the Shorenstein Center, Edward R. Murrow Professor of the Practice of Press, Politics, and Public Policy. She is an essayist. She is an author. She's the former editor-in-chief of Time Magazine. Nancy, thank you so much for being with me today.
Hi, Jackie. Nice to see you.
So we're going to be talking about election lessons learned from 2016 to 2024. And when we were talking about this topic, my first thought was, my gosh, what a lifetime it has been through those dates. And I think my first question for you is, have we learned lessons as the media and as press? Because sometimes there are some days where I wonder if we have.
Well, you could almost turn the question inside out and look at the lessons we've had to unlearn, because we keep on encountering these situations that we've never been in before. And so learning lessons from past elections might not actually be useful. So, the most obvious one is that how much do debates actually matter? And people will point to the fact that Hillary Clinton was widely seen as having won all three debates in 2016, didn't change the outcome in the election. I think it's pretty clear in 2024 that at least so far we can say that the Trump-Biden debate mattered enormously, and that it saw us, switch horses in the middle of the race. So. But, similarly, everything from how much does, the ground game matter, how much does traditional media versus social media versus grassroots organizing matter, the different weight to put on and attention to pay to different forces that shape how elections unfold. We're living through this period of such rapid change, especially in the way we are communicating and consuming information, that learning lessons from the past might actually impede our understanding more than it enhances it. So even knowing how to think about analyzing this election is a challenge to us.
So how do you grapple with it then, if you can't use history as any sort of guide, or it's an imperfect guide? Not that it's ever perfect, but I think you know what I'm saying.
I think, as with so many tools, using them with caution and humility allows them to still be useful. So there are all sorts of ways in which history keeps rhyming, and ways that we can look at how leaders have captured attention in the past and what has been effective. What does that tell us about, for instance, Donald Trump's abiding success through now 3 elections? Someone has done a count of how many months he has been running for president, because he pretty much declared in, the day after he was inaugurated in 2017, right? So, it is possible he has been running for president more than any presidential candidate in American history. Right. I think that there are things that we can learn from history. I think that, for instance, most obviously, the care with which I think we view polling, with the understanding that it's become very hard to both get people to answer pollsters' questions, to answer the phone, heaven knows, or answer an online survey, and then how to make judgments about who's a likely voter, how do we assess who is likely to turn out in different places. I think voters, as well as journalists and political operatives, become more and more sophisticated about ways in which tools that have been valuable in the past, like public opinion surveys, can still be useful, but we should probably use them with a measure of caution and humility that acknowledges just what different territory we are in this time.
So you've written a lot about the divide between Americans, and most recently following the first Trump assassination attempt, which just sounds bizarre coming out of my mouth because now there's been a second. And you posited there was room to bridge that divide. Do you still think so? Because as you mentioned in your piece, right in the immediate aftermath, there were fingers pointing, there were conspiracy theories, and it really didn't seem that anyone's better angels were coming forth at that point. So I'm really curious now that we are, a couple months removed and the race has changed again, what your thinking is.
So that's a really important question, Jackie. And one place I would start is that finger pointing and the conspiracy theories and everything, by and large, was playing out on social media platforms like X or TikTok. And we know that especially on X, even more now in its new incarnation, that the number of people who are actively posting on X is a fraction of the electorate, and a not remotely representative one. And in fact, the vast majority of people, especially people running from center right to center left, say that they seldom or never post on social media. And so the responses to something like that assassination attempt that we see and hear in our feeds should not be taken as in any way a useful representative sample of where public opinion is. So that's one thing. That's a funhouse mirror we hold up to ourselves.
Right.
But a second thing is that pretty consistently, if you pull back and look at the issues that we often characterize as the most divisive issues in the country, whether it's around abortion or immigration or any of the real flashpoints in our guns, for instance, that you don't have to look very hard to find positions that 60, 70% of Americans agree with. That the actual division, and we've seen this when deep red states like Kansas put an abortion ballot measure on the ballot and it passes overwhelmingly, right? So we are often seeing this play out, that in fact our differences around policy prescriptions and directions, people overwhelmingly want to see Social Security and Medicare protected. They overwhelmingly think that we need to control who comes in and out of the country. All of these questions, there's way more agreement than we would ever think. There is, however, obviously deep, profound kind of emotional division and hostility in the way each side views the people across the political divide, which is less about ideology in a way than it is about attitude. And this is sort of where I find reasons for hope, which I'm always looking for, given the times that we're living in.
Right.
But there's a ton of evidence from researchers that there is powerful misconception on both sides, that we see one another through a glass darkly, and that in fact, both sides greatly overestimate how extreme most people on the other side are. There was one political scientist at Stanford who asked Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you think earn more than $250,000 a year? And the typical Democrat said, I think about, 30, 35%. It's more like 2%. He asks Republicans, what percentage of Democrats do you think are gay? And again, Republicans say, about a third of Democrats are maybe 6%. And so whether it is about demographic issues or views about things like teaching history or views of the police or any of these issues, there's a tremendous distortion that tends to make people on each side think that the other side poses this enormous threat to the future of the country and the future of democracy. But it is partly based on these exaggerated cartoon versions that they see in their social feeds, in the media, in coverage. And so this is where a lot of the initiatives that people are taking to try to have people engaging directly, groups like Braver Angels or More in Common or One Small Step, all of these sort of civic initiatives to say we need to get to know each other better. And I think, journalists have an enormous opportunity here to help just break through the cartoon kind of flattened two-dimensional version and help us rediscover one another across these divisions, which is hard to say when we are in the midst of this unbelievably intense election fight.
Completely. But in order to do that, journalists and news organizations need to perhaps rebuild some trust. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how that can be accomplished, because it's on both sides of the political aisle, there has been quite a bit of erosion, culminating to now where there really is a huge trust deficit out there.
There is, although actually these two things are connected, which is you're entirely right. When you see all of the surveys, trust has been declining. It's been declining, not a straight line, but the trend line has been declining for 45 years, right? But when you ask people, do you trust the news sources you consume? People say, oh, yes. It isn't just that people distrust the media. They distrust your media or my media. It's like, I don't like what other people are reading and watching and listening to. I trust what I'm reading and watching and listening to. And so again, you have this, you have this similar divide where people are worried about the information habits and diets of other people. And so I completely agree in the need for news organizations, for media organizations, for sources of information to create the circumstances that people trust them, where we somehow find our way back to having some shared set of facts from which we can have the necessary arguments that have to happen constructively in any democracy. And there's a lot of work going into this about ways that news organizations can operate more transparently and help people even understand how the reporting process works, to be physically in the community. This is where the hollowing out of local news has been so harmful at every level, where people are less likely to encounter a journalist and know how journalists go about their work. And so it's very hard for reporters to even explain, oh, this is what went into my being able to reach these conclusions. This is the number of interviews and the FOIA requests and the data analysis and all of the rigor that goes into a thorough job of reporting. The more people understand that at least is a baseline. And so you're seeing much more transparency in how newsrooms are operating and how they're engaging with their audiences to say, what is it that you need from us? Not just what is it that we think you need to know, as though we are in a position to assign people homework.
Well, it kind of in the same vein, there's been a lot made of the decisions of several news organizations to not report on these hacked materials that are apparently being put out by Iran about internal documents of the Trump campaign. And I've seen a lot of consternation, particularly from some of the former Clinton campaign operatives who saw their emails rolled out and reported on during the 2016 campaign. I've been dying to ask you what you think about this decision, and just when is it important to exercise restraint, and if you think this is an appropriate example of that.
So, as you know well, news organizations have to bring that judgment to all kinds of questions, most obviously national security questions or reporting on things that potentially put soldiers in harm's way, could reveal sources and methods in intelligence gathering. Those conversations have happened between newsrooms and governments certainly forever. I would be so curious to hear from Clinton campaign veterans of assuming they think it was wrong for news organizations to publish John Podesta's emails then. Are they saying it would be right now just to even the score, or is this two wrongs don't make a right? So are they in a position to applaud? We wish you had exercised this judgment sooner, but better late than never. Because I do think that there is much more caution, especially in the age of AI and deepfakes, of newsrooms needing to be really cautious both about the authenticity of materials and the sources and the motivations of sources and the efforts of especially, foreign influence operations to interfere in elections. And I think want our newsrooms to be alert and aware and have really rigorous screening processes in place. And so, if you think about lessons learned, arguably a lesson learned since 2016 is that our elections are we live in a porous information environment, and it is the responsibility of institutions and news organizations to harden our defenses against those who are looking to interfere with the ability of voters to make good decisions.
Do you see something clear that mistakes that continue to be made? Because this is something that perhaps has been corrected. Are there still, some soul searching / work to be done in other areas? I'm thinking something like a horse race. I hear a lot of criticism about covering the presidential campaign breathlessly every single day, every poll, and that sort of thing. Are there other examples of that, do you think?
I mean, it has been fascinating watching the unfolding nature of criticism of how political reporters cover politics. And a lot of it traditionally, when it was targeting mainstream news organizations, was coming from the right. And increasingly, I hear it coming as much or more from the left.
Yeah.
And you've heard this charge. It's about grading on a curve. It's about normalizing. And it's interesting to me that in 2016, there was a lot of criticism, especially of cable networks, for taking Donald Trump's campaign events live and at length and giving much less time to Clinton's events. What I was hearing much more common in this cycle is, oh no, people aren't covering his events, and people need to hear him, and they need to be exposed to the things he is saying. And when you take a 90-minute appearance and you just find a 30-second clip for the evening news, it doesn't actually capture the full range of kinds of arguments he's making and positions he's taking and insults he's leveling. And so it's like, it's the only thing that's consistent is, has cable television figured out how to cover a Trump rally or not? And what would the right way of doing that be? Even writing headlines that avoid false equivalency, writing headlines that don't amplify misinformation. And there's I think been a lot of efforts to be more careful about not repeating a piece of misinformation in the course of trying to inform people that this is being spread. But these are hard questions, especially at a time when lots and lots of people are only seeing little snippets of news in their family chats or in their social feeds. And we can't assume that everyone is going to read a 1,500 word story that gets into all of the nuances and complexities of a topic. And I think these are legitimately challenging things for reporters to be wrestling with, even apart from the eternal arguments about too much coverage of polling, especially when it's a close race. The margin of error suggests that these polls are not really telling us anything that is likely to be actionable intelligence for voters.
Debating polling, I think, is an entirely another panel. I feel like we hear about it constantly. Well, we have a little over a minute left, and I didn't want to end on a downer. I want to hear what you are positive about going, and what's there to look forward to going through the rest of this cycle, because it's been a slog, it's been exciting, it's been historic in so many ways, and there's obviously a lot of concern. But what gives you hope? Because you said you're always looking for hope.
I'm looking for hope also because I feel, and I can't prove this, but we saw record turnout in the last election. And even when there's lots of evidence of people are exhausted, or they're, record news avoidance, or people are or feel alienated from our political, all of these negative indicators, it doesn't mean people don't think the outcome matters or don't think that their vote can necessarily make a difference. And I could be proven wrong if voter turnout goes way down, but my sense, especially among younger people who were less likely and are typically less likely to vote proportionally than older people, I'm surrounded by young people who are earnest and engaged and really believe that we can make progress individually and collectively. And that gives me enormous hope. So I am really hoping that people will continue to be, learning, educating themselves, getting engaged, getting involved. Wherever they fall on the political spectrum, it is better for them to feel like they have a stake in the outcome than just feeling like they are helpless no matter what happens.
Fingers crossed. Nancy Gibbs, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thanks for everyone for listening.
Thank you, Jackie.